Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. We're going to be discussing a few approaches to enterprise cloud management. I'm going to wait just a couple of minutes to give more people the chance to join in and log into the webinar, make sure everything looks good. So in the meantime, just some quick housekeeping. We're recording today's webinar, so if you miss anything or you want to share this with a colleague or you have to drop off, we'll make sure to send you the recording in 24 hours after we're done here. And if you have any questions as we're going along through the presentation and through our discussion today, make sure to submit those questions on the GoToWebinar questions pane. And if we don't get to those, we'll try to answer those as we talk and as we go through the discussion. If we happen to miss some of those or we won't have time to get to them, then we'll definitely follow up over email and share the answers with everybody as we usually do. And the last quick thing that I want to touch on is that make sure you stay tuned for our next webinar that we're going to do next week, which is going to be a technical deep dive into building dynamic applications with Scalr and Chef. So it's going to be more of a technical deep dive on some of the concepts that we'll discuss today. Okay, so I think we're good to go and get started. So first of all, Brett, thank you for joining me today. Can you quickly introduce yourself?
Sure, Brett Johnson. I run sales at Scalr.
All right, and I'm Ron. If you've ever been on a Scalr webinar, maybe you know me. I run marketing for Scalr. And today we want to talk about a few approaches that we're seeing for enterprise cloud management. Basically give them a quick overview and weigh their pros and cons that we'll be able to take those insights and apply them to the companies and enterprises that you work with today. So just a quick look at our agenda. We're going for about 45 minutes. We might go just a little bit over. We'll try to wrap it up in about 45 minutes. So the first thing that we'll talk about is just why are we here? What's the problem we're trying to solve? And what are the challenges and objectives with multi-cloud and hybrid cloud at the enterprise level? Afterwards, we'll cover 3 different approaches that we're seeing out there for capitalizing on the cloud and kind of capturing that cloud opportunity. And finally, we'll wrap it up with a discussion about the business values and outcomes that we're wanting to get with those models. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started first by discussing some of the challenges and objectives that we're seeing out there. So part of the easiest way to do that is to take a look at what some of the analysts are saying, as they have a lot of face time with IT leaders in the community. And if you look over some of these snippets and quotes, you can see pretty much a theme comes out. Like, for example, in the 451 research report, it says that multi-cloud environments are now used by 84% of enterprises, with some of the drivers being speed and agility benefits, while you also see the challenges outlined by, for example, the Gartner reports that put an emphasis on policy and governance. So a lot of this is about capitalizing on business agility, making the enterprise move faster and moving to the cloud in order to make the enterprise move faster without sacrificing some of that agility. You can also see that as a result of all of this, according to the latest Forrester Hybrid Cloud Management Wave, that actually only came out this past Friday, and you can find it actually on Scalr.com on our website if you want to read the full report. But there's been a lot of market growth in the multi-cloud space due to this increasing complexity. We're also going to share these slides with everybody after we're done here, so you'll be able to dig in a bit deeper into this yourselves. So the way we see it is with the move to the cloud, with that main driver being capitalizing on business agility, or more simply speed, making whether it is a faster time to market, or making your support engineers more productive, or making your developers more productive. A lot of the challenges that go along with that stem from the very fundamental difference between how things used to work and how things work today. So if we take a quick look at yesterday, or how IT traditionally worked, we're looking at a world where most of our kind of worldview of the enterprise was centered on one data center or a few data centers, where all of our applications and services lived. So the challenge of control and visibility, obviously not easy, but was more manageable or different from what we have today. And this is a model where centralized type of management makes more sense. While today, we're looking at an explosion of services and an explosion of places where you can actually run your applications and services, and a lot of fragmentation. So you have this promise of speed. You can get things done faster. You can empower your users to be more productive, which is the ultimate goal that we're talking about. But you also now have a situation that calls for a fundamentally different type of management and policy enforcement, and basically methods to gain that assurance model, to know that you're gaining that speed, you're gaining that agility, but you're also not sacrificing things like cost control, for example. You're not blowing budgets, you're not failing audits, you're not sacrificing security, you're minimizing your attack surfaces and things of that nature. So to wrap that part of this up, essentially, what we're going to be talking about, and the main goal that we're seeing with capturing the cloud opportunities at large enterprises, is going after that business agility, leveraging the cloud to empower the business to move faster, innovate, and compete on a global scale. We were talking to one of our customers recently, where he was talking about how some things that might seem very easy for startups might be more difficult for enterprises, just because of all of the compliance reasons and the security reasons that go along with empowering those users with that kind of productivity that the cloud is supposed to give them. So we're talking about, how do you capture that business agility opportunity without compromising on security and compliance, without compromising on the productivity of your users, and still empowering your users, whether they are QA engineers that need to spin up test builds, or DevOps engineers who need as close as they can get to accessing the platforms, and you're not sacrificing your cost control and your visibility in this decentralized, fragmented world of hybrid cloud that we're seeing today. Okay, so basically the landscape that we're seeing out there, we've recognized 3 different approaches to capturing this opportunity. So I want to hand it off to you, Brett, to kind of walk us through some of these options, or if you have anything to add to this kind of bold statements that I just made.
No, thanks, Ron. Yeah, I agree. So I think this is certainly what we're seeing when we speak with our customers. Business agility, as Ron laid out on the previous slides, it is the driver that's obviously making all of the companies that we work with look at how to best leverage the cloud and get all of that in the hands of their users as easily and quickly as we can. So if we want to look at the first kind of category, or the first option that we see, we've labeled it direct access and remediation. And what I really like about this model, and we see this with a lot of companies that are, especially when you're starting out working with the cloud or with multiple platforms, and you're saying, we want to give our users the ability to use, work with Amazon, for example, use a tool like a CloudFormation, use a tool like a Terraform, and actually have some of that infrastructure as code, and some of those values that the DevOps teams have kind of become synonymous with. There's a really interesting and I think valuable component of this, which is this distributed model, where you're empowering the people right at the point of owning their applications, deciding what decisions to make about the right platforms and the appropriate cloud services, the sizing the infrastructure, supporting the infrastructure. I think in premise, it's a really great, interesting model. And for something that Scalr, it's an area we look at, and we're working with a number of our customers who are leveraging those different tools and thinking about how we can kind of help those customers make best use of those tools. And we'll get into that later in the discussion today. But for now, I think what we do see is that when you have a single department or one or more teams kind of rolled up into a department, and you're tasked with, going out using the appropriate platform, especially when you have a limited number of platforms, you can actually handle that pretty well. And we have this labeled as green, and the IT objectives really are, what is it the role of IT in this model? And the things that we hear pretty consistently is that IT can work with these different, development teams in particular, and provide them with approved sets of templates that kind of ensure that the right images are being deployed, and you can kind of put certain things baked into those templates so that you're mitigating to the extent possible any mistakes that can be made. You could put certain other policies, written or scripted, into these as well. And again, at low scale, low volume, this works pretty well. And you see down on the bottom, post-deployment remediation and exception handling, where you're actually saying, well, once something's been deployed, we now need to go back and look at what were the costs of that, who actually deployed it. Let me trace that cost back. Again, when it's small enough deployment, you can manage that. Reclamation, actually, it's harder to set lifecycle management type policies, so you're going back and cleaning up, but again, the volume's not so great. Compliance and policy violations. Compliance-wise, usually these are development systems. These are things you can isolate into a certain part of a network or security group or subnet. You can manage that. As you start to scale, though, and you add another department, you add additional teams, again, I think you can start out doing okay, but as you start to ramp this up and you see like one of these teams is now starting to bring on more requests and is starting to use these platforms more, then you're starting to introduce things like the strain, because again, this is a system that it's not that you can't do it, it's just that where you struggle is you start to increase what you're doing from the post-deployment remediation. And this is the pattern that we see with companies. So you want to retain this distributed model. Absolutely, there's value to that, where the guys that know the applications, know the infrastructure, know the cloud services and all these things, you want them to be able to make best use of those options for them. But you can't be killed with the post-remediation and all the exception handling. So as you scale this even further, what you start to see is that this just starts to become a somewhat untenable model. Now, there's approaches that have been made to try to introduce things like scripted policy management and other forms, and I think what you see from that is then this starts to look a little bit like a centralized approach to how do I add a layer of policy management on what's otherwise a very distributed model, and that's challenging. And this is where I think again companies have struggled. So especially as you add more tools to the guys that are developing things, more platforms, we see that this starts to strain IT. You start to see shadow IT increase, people bypassing those things, and you just wind up with a lot of overhead. So I think, Ron, is there anything else you wanted to add to this? Otherwise, I think we'll come back to this a bit at the end, or we'll kind of highlight this again. But
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, like you said, the premise of this model is solid, right? Because the premise is just like we said earlier, you want to get those users as close as possible to the platforms, make them more productive. The only other thing that I'll add is that the users that will be most productive under this model are those very advanced power users. But at these large enterprises, as well as a lot of our customers and other companies, you see more than one type of user. So scale not just in the aspect of geographies and services and the platforms that you're using, but also the types of users that actually have to interact with this model and script against these platforms becomes a challenge as well, which what leads a lot of these companies that we're talking to look at other models like the next option that we are going to talk about.
Yeah, and I think just to finish off that point on the last model, as Ron highlights, the users that you see that struggle most in that first option are things like your finance folks, your security guys trying to figure out who owns what, and it's again that post deployment remediation stages, reconciling the costs and all of that becomes quite challenging. For this option, this is really the traditional CMP. So, and I say traditional because this isn't new. We've seen variations on this going back to, the first generation of private cloud platforms. Now today you see like a vRealize, or you see any number of companies in this category like a RiceScale or others that are here. And again, it's a traditional approach to how do I solve this challenge. If I have a set of users, in this case we have a single department when we get started, a couple teams, it could be multiple teams, but we have this notion of I have users and teams that want to make requests of, I want an application, I want to deploy it on a set of infrastructure, and central IT would generally be sitting in front of those requests, whether it's a ticketing system through a ServiceNow or whether it's some other private cloud platform where you're ordering through a self-service catalog. And there's a set of infrastructure below. So in this case, we've got platforms like Azure, OpenStack. It could be, it could just be VMware, right? You have companies running everything on VMware. When you've got a fairly simple number of choices in terms of the platforms and a fairly limited number of teams and departments where they're going to make requests, you can manage this, and it's in green as we've pointed out here, where this central IT group sets role-based controls for all the departments, the teams, the users. You've got some consistency over, are the different teams development teams, and do they all kind of work the same way? If there's single line of business, maybe they have similar constraints around security and compliance, and their limited number of geographies. So you can do this. You can define an app catalog that you give choices to all of these different departments and teams to say you can select these, and you have limited options relative to those catalog items. How long can you have it? How much does it cost? Limited platform choices, on and on. The policy management is also done here. So generally the central team will work with the departments, work with the teams, and decide if I were to allow you guys to
Brett, I think I might have lost you there. Okay, so I think we might have lost Brett there, but I'll just pick up his train of thought. So as Brett was saying, this model makes perfect sense for, once again, a limited number of departments and teams operating within those departments. And again, the issue that we're running into, the issue that we're seeing, is again the types of users that you see. So a good example of that is self-service. So self-service can be, for example, just the set of approved catalog items that were created by this central IT function and delivered to these teams. But then again, the question comes up, what if I have different teams that have different types of requirements? So if you see in this box,
just so you're aware.
Okay, great. So I'll just finish this line of thought. But you see that in this box right now that's green, you have your role-based access control, your app catalog, your policy management. All of that has to be done for both of these teams in this department, which, just like Brett said, at a manageable scale makes sense, because now the central IT function has to have context and some sort of insight into what this team actually needs. So what happens once you scale it beyond one team? That's the question that we're asking. So Brett, unless if you're back on, all right, so I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, I think the point being, and I don't know where I cut out, so apologies for that. The office lost the internet signal. So what I was saying here is, as you start to add more departments and teams, where this starts to become a challenge is now when you have diversity now in the role-based controls. You have one team that perhaps has they're in a certain geography where maybe there's more compliance constraints or different constraints, or you have a team that's just set up with more advanced users, where as those users start wanting to consume more of the cloud, and the departments and the teams want to give those users more autonomy, it starts to, again, the lack of standardization is what limits your scale. So each one of these become exceptions. So do I say, okay, well, for all of these other teams and these other departments, these are the types of roles that apply. If you're an end user, you're a developer, you have access to these catalog items, you can make these kind of choices, you can do these things before you need to get an approval. But the more you start to say there's differences by team, the more that each of those create exceptions. And then as you start adding new platforms, and they come with cost, unlike private cloud platforms like a VMware or even an OpenStack, where it's a capacity challenge for the most part, you're managing to capacity figures. When you get into the public cloud, it's hard costs. So if you actually allow somebody to select a certain instance type or keep a system for a little bit longer, all of that has an impact on the bottom line. So the trade-off becomes, can I actually give these teams and these departments some form of autonomy? And actually, one team might say, I've got 5 different developer roles in my team. We're very distributed. We've got different folks doing different roles. I want each of them to have different levels of access and privileges. That starts, as you see here, that big thick line, that becomes a real burden on your central team to try to manage. So do you kick that team out and say, we want you guys to kind of become more of this, go on your own, and then we'll do remediation steps? Or do you try to manage it? And ultimately what starts to happen is, you wind up seeing that IT becomes seen as an inhibitor to this agility, because you have to decide, do I literally let these guys go, or do I still want to retain these controls? If I do, I start to be seen as a bit of an inhibitor.
Yeah. So
the other thing that we notice here is that, Ron, that we point out is that all of these policies, again, are applied app by app. And so unlike organizationally, you might have a certain application that you want to make available to multiple departments, multiple teams, but the way that application is used and certain requirements for that application around placement, where it needs to go, other policies and other things associated with it could be very different. And so because of that, it becomes very difficult to scale. So go ahead, Ron, you were going to say something.
Yeah, so essentially it's just like you said, when you have a team that fits into the mold that you've built, and it could be a very well thought out kind of list of things to offer that team in order for that specific team to be productive, the role-based access control for them, the service catalog for them, or whatever the self-service method is, even if it's something that goes as far as like API access and all the policies for them. So an example of that, you see the team here on the left, this whole department and these teams, they're happy, right? They don't have any problem with what's going on, because everything that they do fits into that mold. Maybe that was the original team that started out building this out, because obviously at an actual enterprise it won't always be as neat as we want it to be. But you see that maybe this team in the middle, they have a couple of requests. This is something that maybe you're still able to handle, but you're still seen as an inhibitor for agility at that point because you do have to make exceptions. I just think that the important thing to remember here is that these lines or these requests, they're not necessarily going to be, hey, I need this database, or hey, I need a machine that gets the latest build from Jenkins or whatever. They're also going to be a security, a compliance officer that says, I need information to pass this audit, or I need to be able to get this financial report, or I need to make sure that in this specific cloud environment, you're not using public networks, you're only using private networks. And that's why it's almost impossible for this central IT function to have context into everything that's going on.
Yeah, so I think, so why don't we go to the last, the third option, Ron?
Sure. Yep, and just like you said earlier, when you have this very advanced team that you see with all of these very more advanced requests, just like you said, what do you do with them? Do you kick them out of the system? So they could do their own thing and be super productive? That is not maybe a terrible option at first, because you're saying, if my ultimate goal is to empower them, maybe that's what I need to do. But then you also introduce all of the challenges from option one. But if you try to put them into this mold, maybe you're breaking their agility. So that becomes another whole conversation to have.
Right. So with the Scalr model, I think what's the interesting thing about the Scalr model is we've tried to take a bit of the things that are really attractive about the distributed model in the first option, where you actually are trying to empower your users and give them access to the underlying applications and infrastructure with as much autonomy as you can possibly do. And at the same time, still manage to do that with the policy-based controls, the visibility around the costs, and all of those other elements that, for the modern enterprise, you still have to do, right? You still have to figure out, I have a budget, I have a cost center, I have a project with associated money, and how do I track all of these expenses and make sure that we're doing our best to keep alignment. So what Scalr's done is we basically have a product that has multiple layers of policy. We have different administrative layers. So you have a corporate layer at Scalr. This is this would be basically your central IT. So your corporate IT. So unlike the CMP type model where that central IT is now trying to do this on behalf of everyone, not only for all of the corporate requirements that are required from cost centers and budgets and all of the policies for access controls. There's certain things, though, that a corporate function will know across the board. No matter which department, which team is doing something, I need to have visibility around costs. I need certain tags. I need everything that's deployed to be assigned to a cost code or a budget or a project. If it's a production system or it's a system deployed by a certain department and it's running in this geography, I want everything to run in, if it's in North America, in US West for Amazon or whatever the policy might be. So there's things that you could do at a corporate level, and then all of those baseline policies would get applied to the different departments. But then at the department level, especially when you have companies that have very different departments, whether its differences are based by geography, could be line of business, it could be whatever the reason might be, that you basically say, for this department, they get their own costs, they have their own budgets, they have their own projects, their own cost centers. This particular department might decide that they can leverage multiple cloud platforms. They want to use both private cloud, maybe VMware, OpenStack. They also want to use Google, for example. Great. So they could set their own sets of policies. They have administrative controls. So unlike the other approach under the Scalr model, they have an actual layer of they have an actual layer of administrative policies that they can set for the different teams. So we have these colors actually we're showing here. The orange layer is a layer in the Scalr product. So if you're in the orange layer, you have essentially you're at the corporate layer. So you are now setting policies. You're the admin for in Scalr. You're at that layer. The green layer, you are at the department layer. So you are able to now, for anything under your department, including all of the different environments are blue, you can now set the administrative privileges for the different departments. So if you have teams, for example, like a development team, and they operate in a certain region, they're focused on, you know, whatever they might be focused on, and you said, I want this team to only be able to deploy to this cloud platform. And if they deploy to this cloud platform, here are the policies that should apply. Those policies will then get picked up. Everything that was set from the corporate layer, everything that was set from the department layer just gets inherited down to the different environments. You don't have to now think about those. Those just get applied. Within the environments, the blue layer, you are now defining your own, you have another layer of an admin. So you've got a team lead, you've got someone responsible for an environment. That team lead knows his team and knows what's going on in his environment better than someone all the way at corporate. You know, again, imagine this is a global enterprise. So you're multiple layers removed if you're at corporate from what's happening at any individual team within a department. So this team can now set administrative control, set role-based controls for the different team in that environment. So there might be 4 or 5 different roles that this team lead decides to assign that apply to his team. And another team in the same department might set very different roles and controls and privileges for that team. So this is the way Scalr is set up. So you have effectively a multi-tenant model. You've got tenant 1, tenant 2, tenant 3. Each one of those, as they're making requests for their different infrastructure and applications, they're going through those requests. You're kind of funneling through the different layers of policy set by the corporate, the department, and the team. Underneath, you've got all of your platforms that obviously you've made available. And then because you're able to set those policies and have so much more autonomy all the way down to the departments and to the different teams, you have far fewer exceptions to manage. The exceptions get managed at the team or at the department. They don't all get impacted back to the corporate layer. So you don't have one team that's basically strangling your central IT group and making every other team now have less responsiveness. That's just the way the model is set up. And we've got these plus signs and then this other arrow, just a notion that we're showing this as kind of a, you know, you can add more tenants as you like. You can just keep scaling those tenants across, and the corporate layer just expands, you know, just slides over. And then similarly, we show, like for the team layer, this is really the environments. You can add multiple teams. So we're showing it on this particular model where each department has a single team, but each department could have multiple teams, just for the sake of keeping the slide less busy than it already is. But that's the idea there.
Yeah, so
Ron,
there's an example that we like to use, or an analogy that we like to use, where this whole model, of delegated autonomy and giving the departments and the teams that report into those departments or lines of business or business units, giving them more freedom or more autonomy to be productive and to do what they need to do because they have more context into the resources that they need. A lot of it is based on the fact that in order to be productive, you need a certain layer of context, and that you have more than one type of user in your team or in your enterprise, whether that user is what we internally call a service catalog user, a user that values ease of use over operational flexibility. They need one-click provisioning, versus a power user or a DevOps user who needs API access, who needs more advanced type of access. So this whole model, if you kind of equate it to basically how a government works, or the US government specifically. So if, for example, you have a real estate agent in Boston, Massachusetts, that wants to solve some zoning issue. I'm not from the US, so forgive me if my example is not spot on, but the concept is there. Let's say that he wants to solve that zoning issue. He won't go directly to Congress, right? Because then Congress will be incredibly backlogged with every request coming from everybody in their respective cities. They'll have this huge backlog. They'll have to come up with a system to go through it all, which we see, similar to like a ticketing system. And then Congress is expected to facilitate that agility, but they're seen as an inhibitor of it. So that's obviously not the way it works. The way it works is that the administration gives the state of Massachusetts and the city of Boston, respectively, some autonomy and more context in order to answer those types of requests. So that real estate agent goes to the city of Boston, which has some delegated autonomy from the state, which has some delegated autonomy from the administration. So very similar to this, essentially what you're doing here is you're flipping this model that we've seen up until now, where you are trying to centralize everything through this one box, and then at some point, either the box has to get bigger or it breaks, and there's a limit to how much money you can throw at the problem to try and hire and train more people. So essentially, you have these departments and you have these teams closer to the actual platforms. And the exception handling obviously will still be there, because maybe at some team level or some department level, you build a service catalog or you build a system, and then there's an organizational change. But since you've now decoupled your policy from your infrastructure effectively, you're better positioned to handle those changes. So as we kind of to recap some of this, you have multiple administration tiers and multiple tiers of role-based access control. Each one of these layers gets a certain kind of portion of autonomy and freedom. The policies are applied at the organization level, not app by app. So you can apply a certain policy at the corporate layer, which will then be propagated down to all of those other layers, the department layer, the team layer, and reporting goes the other way. So you're able to still see your reports and your financial reports and everything at the corporate layer. And it makes you better able to adapt to organizational changes and policy changes, since if you need to change a policy, and it could be something as simple as Amazon just introduced a new family of instances and you want to make them available for a specific environment, or you need to make that policy change that I mentioned earlier to make sure that only private networks are used in some staging environment. You'll make that policy change at the appropriate level, and then it will be propagated for all the relevant layers that report up to that higher administration tier. So the result of this is that the greater autonomy for these teams results in greater speed at scale, or greater productivity at scale, which is essentially where we started the business agility goal, without having to compromise on your security and your cost and your compliance. Brett, anything you want to add on to that before we move on?
Yeah, I say the only other thing I'd point out on this is that the architecture of the Scalr product it's built for this scale, and we're using it in the context of an enterprise customer. We also work with partners. I know there's some partners probably on this webinar. And so Scalr has for years now supported a number of like tens of companies that are running on what we call a hosted version, a SaaS version. We don't promote it. It's not something that we actively do really for our enterprise customers, but it's really a validation of this tool from each company that uses it gets their own dedicated instance. They're basically a department. They're a unique tenant. They can set their own teams. And the reason I point that out is that for partners that are managed service providers, we're starting to work increasingly with managed service providers where they have customers, and you could use a similar model like this. The product works very, very well. It's a very well suited model for that. So I just wanted to again, point that out. It's not only an enterprise example that could also be used for partners that are setting up like a managed service practice.
Definitely. So for kind of the next section that we wanted to go over, to kind of summarize a lot of the concepts that we went over, first let's recap the actual business objectives that that most enterprises or partners or managed service providers at the end of the day are going to go after. So those business outcomes are going to be increasing overall speed, that business agility, and creating a space where you're able to drive innovation across your enterprise without giving up on a lot of those other components that we talked about, some of which will be reclaiming control over your security and governance while maximizing your user productivity. So all of this really rolls up into the same argument of you want to capture that business agility without giving up on your security, without giving up on your cost optimization or the productivity or of your users. So what I'd like for us to do now is just talk a little bit about the actual business value of it. So Brett, can you walk us through this example? If you're still on, I think we might have lost you. Yep. Okay, thought we lost you again.
Yeah, no, yeah. So this is a model that we basically put together to show how we see, Scalr and kind of how we look at ourselves is delivering business value. So if you look at time to deliver, that's what we're really focused on. So how do you deliver all of these choices to the different users as effectively as you can, so that they can go off and move at maximum pace? And at the same time, if you look, so that's on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, you've got cost optimization and security. So how do you, in an ideal world, get really fast delivery and also get highly optimized cost and security at limited complexity? So going back to where we've kind of gone through each one of these options, at limited complexity with a single department, a couple teams, limited choice around platforms, really anything that you do, you can make work. And I think that's the point we're making here, is that whether it's a CMP, whether it's Scalr, I think you can still deliver this. Now, if we were to put our option one on the scale, I think what you'd see is you'd still be very good on the time to delivery. You're challenged a bit on the cost optimization and security. And one of the things that Scalr is trying to do is we're working on that challenge to work with customers that are trying to implement, even for one or more teams, that option one type model, and actually bring them into that upper right quadrant. So this is something we'll do a future webinar on. It is something we really are excited about. I think we'll have a good story for. But for now, if we just look at the Scalr versus like the traditional CMP approach, as you start to increase the complexity, as you start to add platforms and applications and different business units, geographies, the challenge becomes, how do you do it without slowing things down? As we pointed out before, it's that you don't really want to lose much on the cost optimization and security, because again, you're going through and every request is checked. It's checked against policy. You have exception handling to make sure that people aren't violating those policies, but you start running into trade-offs. So I can become a real blocker, and or I can start giving some teams some ability to have more autonomy, and I might be sacrificing certain things around cost and security. So I think that the challenge here is, with Scalr, what we view as the model that we've chosen really helps us stay in that upper right, because we have a really good way to handle the complexity as that increases. So really, I think that's it for this slide, Ron. It's just a visual to show folks kind of how we differentiate.
Yeah, definitely. So essentially what you see here, that as we kind of slide the overall complexity, business unit geographies more to the right, you essentially see how the other models that we talked about, model 1, model 2 strain, and we hope that we kind of helped you understand why that is. We're gonna wrap it up because we're coming up on that 45-minute mark. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And Brett, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. As I said, the webinar is going to be recorded. You'll get the recording to your inbox very soon. If you have any questions, you can either send me a note directly at ron@scalr.com. You can find more information on our website, as well as our next webinar next week, Tuesday, same time, which will be a technical deep dive into a lot of the concepts that we covered while focusing on integrating Scalr and Chef to create dynamic applications. So that's going to be a really exciting one as well. So I hope to see everybody there. So once again, thanks everybody, and we hope to catch you on the next one. Thanks, Brett.
Yep, thank you.